Hi everyone, David Aragona here with Craig Milkowski, and we are taking a look at the feature race at Belmont Park on Saturday, one of 6 New York bred stakes races on that Saturday card. It is race 9, the Empire Classic Handicap, going a mile and an eighth around one turn on that Belmont Oval, the main track. And we've got a field of 8 New York breds going postward. Let's throw up the field for this race. We've got 7 older horses here, Craig, including the venerable Mr. Buff, who is seeking his third consecutive victory in this race. But those 7 older horses are facing off against a pretty talented 3-year-old American Revolution, who I think they're all going to have a tough time getting around.
Yeah, I think he's clearly the horse to beat. He's improving. He's a horse who has room to keep growing. Whereas these others, I mean, we kind of know what they are at this point when they run their best races. They pretty much all run around the 120 type speed figure. Mr. Buff used to run some bigger ones, but he's been a bit off form. So I think the race definitely goes through American Revolution.
Let's talk a little bit about Mr. Buff and the trip that he's likely to get as we move on to the Timeform US pace projector in this race, because I think it's an interesting discussion to begin with. Mr. Buff is shown on the early lead here, Craig, but something he hasn't been able to do in his last couple starts is make the lead, as some horses, including some other ones in this race, have been thorns in his side. The number 7 Seafoam, Craig, is one that I think maybe shown a little bit too far back on the pace projector because he's coming out of a mile-and-a-half race last time.
Yeah, I mean, it's not just that. That race shouldn't really be counted because we look at, I think it's the best 3 out of the last 5. But sometimes a pace projector has some trouble catching up. Mr. Buff is shown on the front end, even though he hasn't really shown that kind of high speed lately. Seafoam was in some races with some slow paces, but I think this one's kind of muddled. But if I had to place a wager on who was going to lead after the quarter mile, my money might be on Seafoam.
Yeah, I tend to agree with that because I think you also have to take rider intention into account. And the rider of Mr. Buff, or the recent rider, Junior Alvarado, he's just not the most aggressive jockey coming out of the starting gate. Whereas Seafoam this day is going to be ridden by Kendrick Carmouche. And I would imagine he's going to be hustling that one to the front end, because we'll talk about Seafoam a little bit more in a bit. But he's one that does run his best races when he's on the front end. Let's start the conversation, though, with that favorite among the contenders, Craig, the number 5 American Revolution. And we'll take a look at his race or 2 back, I should say, when he won the Albany up at Saratoga. This was one that came back surprisingly fast from a speed figure standpoint. The horse that he's beating here, Bobby Bow, was a shipper for Bob Baffert, who had run pretty fast out in California, and American Revolution, as you can see, handles him pretty easily. And he came out of this race, Craig, to run a big one next time out in the Pennsylvania Derby.
He did. He looked really good this day. I remember making the speed figure for that, and I kind of get flags when figures might be a little high for the class, just to check and make sure I didn't make a typo. And his was certainly not. He was in raging form. It was his 3rd win in a row. He won by 5 lengths, and everything about the figure checked out. So he got a 120 that day. As I said, he showed up ambitiously placed in that Pennsylvania Derby, but he certainly didn't disgrace himself that day. As you can see, I have it highlighted. He's improving his speed figure every time out. And what I really liked in that Pennsylvania Derby is how close he was to that really fast pace being set by Hot Rod Charlie. He did back up some, but he finished a good 3rd, was beaten just over 6 lengths. And there were some pretty good horses that finished in behind him. So I don't think there's anything fluky about that 125 speed figure he ran. And it just seems like, going back to New York breds, he almost has his field over a barrel.
No, I tend to agree. That Pennsylvania Derby was among the fastest races, at least among the routers in the 3-year-old division that we've seen this year. And he was not disgraced, as you said, behind horses like Hot Rod Charlie and Midnight Bourbon. They arguably could have gotten way more ambitious with American Revolution out of that race, but they're taking the path of least resistance for now, facing New York breds. Maybe this will serve as a stepping stone to a race like the Grade 1 Clark at Churchill a bit later in the year. But nobody else is running recently, I should say, among his older rivals, or running speed figures on the Timeform US scale like 125, what he got last time in the Pennsylvania Derby. So a repeat of that performance is going to make American Revolution pretty tough for these older horses to handle in the Empire Classic. Let's talk about that horse that we were mentioning with regard to the pace projector, though, Seafoam, as we take a look at his past performances. And as you can see, he does do his best running when he's able to make the front end, something he was able to do 2 back in the Evan Shipman. But Craig, I know you want to highlight the fact that he won a mile-and-a-half last time, and it's probably a race that we can kind of just draw a line through.
Yeah, even despite the fact, I mean, he set was, I guess, a slow pace for a mile and a half. We don't have a whole lot to go on in those spots. But before that, he was able to set solid paces, going a mile and an eighth distance on both a sloppy and a fast track. And he ran 119 and 120 speed figures. So I definitely think he's dangerous in this spot is if he's able to get clear early. The thing I like about American Revolution is he's able to stay close, but doesn't need the lead. But lone speed is always dangerous. Now, whether he can get there is another story. But as I mentioned earlier, if I had to wager on who'd be in front, I'd probably go with Seafoam.
And Seafoam was able to make the lead in that Evans ship. And let's take a look at the replay of that race too, back on August 11th at Saratoga. He's beating a couple of rivals that he's facing again here. Actually, three rivals that he's facing again here because Mr. Buff was also in this race. That's him tiring on the rail in the green cap. But Three Jokers is behind him, as is Danny California. Seafoam got to the front end, and he's just able to kick away in the stretch. He was racing off the claim for Michelle Giangulio and 10 Strike Racing in this spot after having previously been with the Christophe Clement barn. He loved the mile and an eighth at Saratoga on this occasion, but didn't get that much pace pressure. He might have a more competitive pace situation to deal with here in this Empire Classic. We'll see who tries to challenge it in the early going. Let's move on to Mr. Buff, that horse who is going for his third consecutive victory in this Empire Classic. And Craig, I know this is one that we might root for as fans, but I think it's going to be a little bit tough to make a case for Mr. Buff off his last couple of efforts.
Yeah, I guess the real angle, the only angle is what you mentioned. He's shooting to win this race for the third consecutive time. But looking at his past performances, he's just a horse who's really gone off form. And what most alarms me is the fact that he seems to have lost his early speed. Now, some of that could be the rider, as you said, wasn't particularly aggressive his last time, but he's just been outkicked early in his races. And he's a horse to when sometimes he's able to come from just off the pace, but the races he did that in, he was pretty heavily favored, seemed to really have a big advantage on the field. He doesn't have that anymore, and I think he needs to use his speed, and I'm just not sure that he has it. I kind of noted in the comments in both of his last two, the chart caller noted that he was coaxed, this basically saying he had to be urged to give his best running even earlier in the race. And I just don't think that's a very good sign.
Yeah, he was just a little bit dull in those last couple of starts. I thought that the chart comment last time was maybe being a little bit charitable. Junior Alvarado really made no attempt to get him forward that day. If you watch the start, he kind of came out with the intention to rate Mr. Buff, which I thought was a mistake. Hopefully he's a little more aggressive here because I agree Mr. Buff does have his best chance when he's on the front end, though I see you're also noting Mr. Buff's recent workouts, and he's a horse that we have seen come into races with some really fast drills showing in the past. Not necessarily the case for this race. I wonder if, as an older horse, they're just trying to go a little bit easier on him in the morning. I did watch one of his recent workouts training for this race in company with a vastly inferior horse from the John Kimmel barn, and Mr. Buff handled that one quite easily without being asked for anything in the morning. He's really a workout star in the morning, and I think he's been training that way recently, even though the times don't look that fast. But he's got to show up in the afternoon. I'll be rooting for him. Anybody who follows me on social media knows that I'm a huge fan of this horse. I just don't think I can bet him in this race at what is likely to be second or third choice in the wagering. Let's move on to a couple of horses that are going to be trying to step up in class. Tiergan and Three Jokers, who faced off last time in the off-the-turf Ashley T. Cole. Let's take a look at the stretch run of this race, and you'll see it's not a big field as they come into the lane. Just three horses competing in this race, and the two that are battling to the wire are the ones that will come out of it and contest this Empire Classic. Do you give any of these a shot, Craig?
I mean, I guess they have a shot, but I suspect they're gonna get bet off these races. And I'm just not a huge fan of these races with tiny fields. I'm not a huge fan of off the turf races. I mean, they've run solid speed figures regardless, so I guess you have to make them contenders. And neither one of them would shock me. But when it comes to these two, I don't even know which way I'd lean over the two of them. I guess I'd probably go over Three Jokers. I'd probably go with Three Jokers because he took a little bit of the tougher of it last time, chasing City Man early and what was a pretty quick pace, whereas Tiergan got the lay off of him. He has beaten Tiergan before, so I guess I prefer Three Jokers slightly, but I would make these two the second and third most likely winners, and maybe even third and fourth behind Seafoam.
Yeah, I'm not sure how much money these horses are going to take. They are taking a big step up in class. They've never faced, or at least I should say, Tiergan has never faced the kind of horses that he's running against. Tier 3 Jokers did run in that Evan Shipman behind Seafoam 2 back, but he was really no match for Seafoam that day when he conceded the early lead. We'll see if he's more aggressively ridden this time because he is drawn inside of all the other speed horses. So maybe Jose Ortiz will feel some impetus to be more aggressive in this situation. Tiergan, Craig, the speed figure 2 back, you might remember I had a bit of a disagreement with you about that one. I didn't think the race actually was as fast as maybe the time form US speed figure had it. I know that he's a horse that is not rated quite as highly on the buyer scale if you look at those. So I feel like maybe he'll be a bigger price in this race. Ultimately, I just thought that others had a bit of a class edge over both of these runners. One horse that I do want to mention that is going to be a bigger price in this race is the number 6, Danny California. He ran a really big race 3 back at Saratoga when he got that 120 time form US speed figure. And he earned that pretty legitimately, showed good tactical speed that day, earned it going this 1.125 distance. They wheeled him back just 4 days later when he ran that Evan Shipman. And, that was that speed favoring track on August 11th. He just didn't have the right set of circumstances working in his favor that day. And then last time at Saratoga, again, another track that, although it's not noted in the time form USPPs, I felt it was somewhat speed favoring, and he was just really never in a position to get into a race that was won on the front end by Thomas Shelby. So I feel like maybe Danny California's form is a little bit dirtied up, Craig, and he has the back races that says, he could get in the mix here.
Yeah, he does. And as we noted on the pace cast this week, Thomas Shelby actually came back to run a really nice race. Got a 120 time form US speed figure for his win at Keeneland. So he's a horse in really good form. So I'm going to have to go back and watch that replay of that race with Thomas Shelby and Mystic Knight. Maybe I dismissed this horse a little too easily.
Let's throw up our picks for this race, and Craig and I are on the same page with regard to our top pick. We're both not trying to beat the favorite American Revolution. I pegged him at 7-5 on the morning line. We'll see how much money some of his rivals like Mr. Buff and Seafoam takes, but I'm not going to be surprised if this horse actually goes a little bit lower than that. Just seems that there are a lot of arrows pointing in the direction of this improving 3-year-old. Craig, we'll go in slightly different directions underneath, though, if you're going to play exactas or trifectas in this race.
Yeah, I went with, I think it was Tiergan. I don't have the numbers in front of me, but I'm just a little less favorable of Seafoam and Mr. Buff. They're horses who I think we've probably seen their best, and maybe I was looking for some up and comers. So a couple moving up in class in the 3-year-olds, underneath of the 3-year-old for me.
Yeah, I reluctantly divorced myself from Mr. Buff in my top 4 picks today. I put that long shot Danny California second. I think he might run a big race, but I think he and all the other older horses might be hard pressed to beat the number 5 American Revolution in the Empire Classic on Saturday at Belmont Park. Good luck if you're playing this weekend.